Welcome back to Journey to XRP. Right now, owning one XRP feels easy. It costs less than a few dollars, it's available on almost every major exchange, and most people treat it like spare change. Something you can buy, forget about, and maybe sell later if price goes up. That perception is exactly why this conversation matters. Because what if that sense of abundance is an illusion? What if the real story of XRP has nothing to do with today's price and everything to do with how global finance is quietly being rebuilt underneath the surface? Not a hype-driven pump, not a retail frenzy, but a structural shift that changes who can access XRP at all. When people argue against XRP's potential, they almost always point to the same number, 100 billion tokens. To them, that number alone is enough to dismiss the entire idea. There's too much supply, it can never be scarce, it can never be valuable. That sounds logical on the surface, but it ignores the one thing that actually matters in real markets: liquidity. Total supply is not the same as usable supply. Most XRP is not sitting in a giant pile waiting for retail buyers. A significant portion is locked in escrow. Another large portion is held by long-term holders who haven't moved their XRP in years. But the real supply pressure doesn't come from people holding. It comes from what XRP is designed to do. Think about your home's water system. You don't think about the pipes, you only think about the water coming out of the tap, but the pipes are what make everything work. If the pipes are limited, the water flow is limited too. XRP is not the water, XRP is the pipe. XRP was designed as a bridge asset. Its purpose is to move value quickly between systems. When banks use it for cross-border settlement, they're not buying it to sit on it like a long-term investment the way retail does. They're using it as working liquidity. And working liquidity behaves very differently from speculative supply. Now scale that idea up. The global financial system moves trillions of dollars every single day. Legacy systems like SWIFT handle enormous volumes, but they do it slowly, expensively, and inefficiently. If even a fraction of that value begins moving through a system that uses XRP as a bridge, the math changes fast. At that point, 100 billion tokens no longer looks like a large number. It starts to look very small. This is where the warning about 99% really comes from. It's not about price predictions, it's about access. For years, retail investors have dominated XRP ownership. They endured lawsuits, uncertainty, regulatory confusion, and long periods of boredom. But that phase doesn't last forever. Systems don't get built for retail traders. They get built for institutions. And institutions care about efficiency, cost reduction, and reliability, not speculation. As infrastructure matures, ownership dynamics change. Retail tends to think in terms of price targets and exit points. Institutions think in terms of liquidity pools, settlement corridors, and operational necessity. When an asset moves from being speculative to being functional, it slowly gets absorbed into systems where it is no longer freely traded the way it once was. That doesn't happen overnight, it happens quietly. And here's the uncomfortable part. Most people don't lose access because price explodes instantly. They lose access because they sell early, get bored, or assume they'll always be able to buy back later. Markets are very good at creating that illusion. This is why today feels deceptive. XRP feels cheap, it feels common, it feels easy to access, but infrastructure assets always feel that way before they matter. They look boring until the world depends on them. This video isn't about guaranteeing outcomes. It's about challenging assumptions, especially the assumption that today's abundance will always exist tomorrow. In the next section, we'll move forward and talk about what actually drives supply compression, not hype, not holding, but usage, and why utility changes everything about how scarcity works. That's where the real shift begins. Now let's move forward and talk about the single biggest misunderstanding in crypto, the difference between holding an asset and using an asset, because this is where XRP completely breaks the mental model most people are still operating with. Most cryptocurrencies are treated like digital collectibles. You buy them, you hold them, and you hope someone else pays more later. Scarcity in that world comes from people refusing to sell. That is not how XRP is designed to work. XRP's scarcity does not come from hoarding, it comes from function. XRP is a bridge asset. That sounds simple, but the implications are massive. A bridge asset is not meant to sit still. It is meant to move value between systems that don't trust each other, don't share liquidity, or don't operate on the same rails. Banks don't need to believe in XRP. They don't need to love it. They just need it to be cheaper, faster, and more efficient than the alternative. And that's where utility starts to overwhelm speculation. Let's put this in real-world terms. Today's global financial system moves trillions of dollars every single day. Systems like correspondent banking and SWIFT are slow, layered, and capital inefficient. Money gets trapped in pre-funded accounts all over the world just so transactions might settle smoothly. That is dead capital. Institutions hate dead capital. XRP's role is to remove that inefficiency. When a bridge asset is used for settlement, the same unit of liquidity can be reused over and over again. That sounds like it should reduce demand, but in practice, it does the opposite. Because as transaction volume increases, the system needs more liquidity available at all times to avoid bottlenecks. That liquidity has to come from somewhere. Now, this is where people get tripped up. They assume banks will just buy XRP once and be done. That's not how operational liquidity works. Liquidity must be available continuously across corridors, across time zones, and across unpredictable demand spikes. That means XRP doesn't just get used, it gets allocated. Allocated liquidity is not sitting on an exchange. Allocated liquidity is not waiting for retail buyers. Allocated liquidity is effectively removed from casual circulation. And that's before we even talk about scale. If a system begins handling serious volumes, not retail remittances, but institutional flows, the unit value of the bridge asset matters. A low-value bridge requires enormous quantities to move large amounts of money. That creates friction. The system naturally pushes toward higher unit value to reduce strain. This is why utility assets tend to concentrate value rather than disperse it. Now, layer institutions on top of this. Institutions do not buy assets the way retail does. They don't use Coinbase apps. They don't FOMO into green candles. They source liquidity through deep pools, negotiated arrangements, and structured access. And once they commit to a system, they don't want volatility driven by retail emotion interfering with operations. So what happens? Retail dominance fades. Not because retail is forced out by price alone, but because the asset slowly stops behaving like a toy. It becomes boring. It becomes technical. It becomes something most people no longer understand or want to think about. That's how infrastructure assets mature. This is also why the cheap price argument collapses under utility. Cheap is a retail concept. Institutions don't care if something is cheap or expensive. They care if it works at scale. And if it works at scale, price eventually adjusts to reflect the amount of value being routed through it. That adjustment doesn't ask permission. The danger for retail is not that XRP suddenly becomes unaffordable overnight. The danger is that people keep thinking in speculative terms while the asset quietly transitions into a functional role. By the time the shift is obvious, access has already changed. This is the pattern we've seen before with infrastructure in every era. The early phase feels open, abundant, and dismissible. The mature phase feels closed, technical, and inaccessible. So when people hear warnings about 99%, they think it's about price. It's not. It's about who the system is built for once it turns on. We'll move forward and get very specific about how supply actually tightens through burning, liquidity pools, and automated market mechanics, and why usage creates scarcity far more effectively than speculation ever could. That's where the math starts to matter. Now let's move forward and get specific about how supply actually tightens, because this is where theory turns into mechanics. This isn't about people refusing to sell. It's about XRP being pulled into roles where it simply isn't available for casual trading anymore. First, we need to clear up a common misunderstanding around stablecoins and XRP's role in the system. When people hear about Ripple introducing stablecoins like RLUSD, some assume that makes XRP unnecessary. The logic goes, why use a volatile asset when you can just use a stablecoin? That sounds reasonable until you understand how settlement systems actually work. A stablecoin is the container. XRP is the connector. Stablecoins are great for representing value. They are not designed to bridge liquidity between different systems efficiently at scale. That job still requires a neutral, fast, liquid asset that can move across ledgers and jurisdictions without relying on pre-funded accounts. XRP fills that role. Stablecoins make onboarding easier, but they don't replace the bridge. They increase demand for it. Now let's talk about burning, because this is often misunderstood too. Every transaction on the XRP ledger consumes a very small amount of XRP as a fee. that XRP is permanently destroyed. One transaction doesn't matter, 10 transactions don't matter, but millions of transactions day after day, year after year do matter. Burning isn't a hype narrative. It's a slow, cumulative effect that becomes relevant only when usage reaches scale. And scale is the key word. If XRP is used lightly, burn is irrelevant. If XRP is used heavily, burn becomes structural. But burning alone isn't the real driver of supply compression. The bigger factor is liquidity lockup. This is where automated market makers and liquidity pools come into play. When XRP is placed into an AMM or a liquidity pool, it is no longer sitting on an exchange waiting for someone to hit the sell button. It is actively working, facilitating trades, earning fees, supporting settlement. That XRP is functionally removed from the open market for as long as it remains deployed. Now think about incentives. Institutions don't want idle assets. They want yield, efficiency, and reliability. If XRP can be used productively, whether through liquidity provision, settlement corridors, or structured financial products, then large amounts of XRP naturally migrate into these roles. And once they're there, they tend to stay there. This is how a liquidity black hole forms. The more the network is used, the more XRP is required to keep it functioning smoothly. The more XRP is required, the more gets allocated into working roles. The more gets allocated, the less is available for new buyers. That feedback loop tightens supply without needing hype, coordination, or mass holding behavior. This is very different from a speculative squeeze. Speculative squeezes are violent and obvious. Utility-driven squeezes are quiet and persistent. Most people miss them because they're watching price instead of function. Another important point here is where institutions source XRP. They don't rely on retail exchanges the way individuals do. They use deep liquidity pools, negotiated access, and long-term arrangements. That means retail holders often don't see the demand directly. They just see price not reacting the way they expect. That disconnect creates frustration, and frustration causes people to sell. This is why supply compression often accelerates after retail exits. XRP doesn't need retail participation to function. Once utility takes over, retail becomes optional, not essential. And that's the uncomfortable truth most people avoid. Scarcity created by hype collapses when sentiment changes. Scarcity created by usage persists as long as the system is used. This is why arguments about there's plenty of XRP miss the point. The question isn't how many tokens exist. The question is how many are available for speculative trading once the network is actually doing work. As more XRP is burned slowly, locked into AMMs allocated to settlement corridors and reserved for operational liquidity, the free float shrinks. Not dramatically, not overnight, but consistently. That's how infrastructure assets evolve. We'll move forward and connect these mechanics to the bigger institutional shift, regulation, global standards, and why XRP keeps being discussed as a potential reserve or neutral settlement layer. That's where the long-term picture starts to come together. Now let's move forward and place all of this into the bigger institutional picture, because supply mechanics only matter if there is a system ready to use them. This is where regulation, global standards, and long-term planning come into play, and where XRP starts being discussed very differently from most crypto assets. For years, one of the biggest roadblocks for XRP was regulatory uncertainty, especially in the United States. While retail focused on price stagnation and lawsuits, something else was happening quietly in the background. Ripple continued expanding outside the US, working with banks, payment providers, and regulators in regions that were more willing to experiment with new financial infrastructure. That mattered more than most people realized. Institutions do not move until rules are clear. They don't gamble on legal ambiguity. When clarity starts to arrive, even slowly, it unlocks planning that may have been sitting on hold for years. That doesn't show up as instant demand. It shows up as integration timelines, pilot programs, and long-term infrastructure decisions. This is also where ISO 2022 becomes important. ISO 2022 is the new global standard for financial messaging. In simple terms, it's a common language that banks around the world are moving towards so they can exchange richer, more structured data. This isn't optional. It's a global upgrade to how money talks to itself. Why does this matter for XRP? Because systems that want to operate globally need assets that can plug into this new language cleanly. Assets that are slow, opaque, or incompatible become friction points. Assets that are fast, neutral, and interoperable become bridges. This is why XRP keeps appearing in discussions about cross-border settlement. Not because of marketing, but because it fits the technical and operational requirements institutions are moving toward. That doesn't mean XRP is guaranteed to be chosen everywhere. It means it remains eligible in a world where many assets are not. Now let's talk about the idea that makes people uncomfortable: reserve usage. A reserve asset is not something you use to buy groceries. It's something institutions hold to support liquidity, settlement, and confidence. Gold played this role historically. Treasury bonds play a version of it today. In a tokenized world, the question becomes obvious. What neutral asset bridges value between different national systems without relying on one country's currency? That's where XRP enters the conversation, not as a certainty, but as a candidate. If central banks issue digital currencies, and if stablecoins represent national or corporate liabilities, then something neutral is needed to move value between them efficiently. That neutral asset cannot be controlled by any single government, cannot be inflated arbitrarily, and must operate at global scale. XRP fits those constraints more closely than most alternatives. Again, this is not a promise, it's a framework. What matters is how institutions think. They don't look at charts first. They look at standards, compliance, scalability, and neutrality. They care about whether an asset reduces friction in the system they are building, and if it does, they plan around it long before retail notices. This brings us back to access. When assets become embedded into financial infrastructure, ownership dynamics change. The asset is no longer for everyone, in the way a speculative token is. It becomes something that is held, reserved, and deployed strategically. Retail doesn't get kicked out by force. Retail gets priced out by relevance. The system doesn't need millions of people holding XRP in wallets if it's being used by a smaller number of large participants to move enormous value. That's the shift most people underestimate. Scarcity doesn't come from popularity, it comes from necessity. This is why price alone is such a poor signal during transitions like this. Infrastructure gets built long before it's obvious. And once it's obvious, the opportunity usually looks very different. Bring this to the real warning, because this has never been about predicting a price. It's about understanding psychology, timing, and the kind of transition that quietly locks most people out without them ever realizing it happened. Markets don't usually remove people through force, they remove them through behavior. Most retail investors don't lose exposure because an asset becomes impossible to buy overnight. They lose exposure because they sell early, they sell when boredom sets in, they sell when price finally moves enough to feel life-changing, even though it's only the beginning of a much larger shift. That's how the 99% exits. Imagine buying XRP at 50 cents. Price climbs to $5. That's a 10 times return. For most people, that feels like success. They pay off debt, buy something tangible, and tell themselves they'll re-enter later. But later rarely comes the way they expect. If price keeps moving, fear replaces patience. If price stalls, doubt replaces conviction. Either way, the position is gone. This isn't a moral failure, it's human nature. Markets are designed to exploit this exact behavior. Long periods of boredom shake out the impatient. Sudden moves convince people they're up enough. And by the time the asset's true role becomes clear, ownership has already concentrated elsewhere. This is why the idea that 99% will never own one XRP isn't really about affordability, it's about retention. We've already seen this pattern with Bitcoin. Most people today don't own a full Bitcoin, they own fractions. Not because Bitcoin disappeared, but because it matured. The difference is that Bitcoin is primarily a store of value. XRP is designed to be utility. Utility assets don't just get held, they get absorbed. As XRP is allocated into liquidity pools, settlement corridors, AMMs, institutional reserves, and operational buffers, it stops circulating freely. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily. The more useful it becomes, the less available it is for casual ownership. That's the part people miss. The real risk isn't a market crash, it's a market lockout. There may come a time when XRP is technically available, but practically inaccessible. Liquidity is thin. Spreads are wide. Exchanges offer fractions or tokenized exposure rather than whole units. Not because of a conspiracy, but because the asset has moved into a different phase of its life cycle. Infrastructure doesn't ask permission to become exclusive. It becomes exclusive because the system depends on it. This is why focusing only on price misses the point. Price is a reflection, structure is the cause, and structure changes before price does. Another mistake people make is assuming this is guaranteed. It isn't. This entire thesis depends on a specific future, one where Ripple's technology continues to be adopted, where global standards matter, where institutions choose interoperability over fragmentation. That future is plausible, not promised. Anyone telling you otherwise is selling certainty they don't have. And that's why responsibility matters. You don't win by believing blindly. You win by understanding risk, managing expectations, and knowing why you hold something. If your plan is to trade XRP back into fiat at the first sign of excitement, that's a valid choice. But it's a different strategy than treating it as exposure to financial infrastructure. The warning is not buy at all costs. The warning is understand what you're holding. If XRP truly becomes part of the plumbing of a tokenized world, where real estate, stocks, commodities, identities, and currencies move on-chain, then the most valuable assets won't be the tokens themselves. They'll be the networks that move them. History has been very clear on that point. Most people focus on the app. Very few focus on the protocol. So the question you have to ask yourself isn't whether XRP will succeed, it's whether, if it does, you'll still be positioned, or whether you traded long-term access for short-term comfort. And before we end, I need to be clear. Nothing in this video is financial advice. This is for educational and informational purposes only. Markets are risky. You can lose money. You should always do your own research and make decisions based on your own financial situation and risk tolerance. The warning is simple. Don't let today's abundance blind you to tomorrow's structure. Scarcity doesn't arrive with noise. It arrives quietly while most people are looking somewhere else. That's it for today on Journey to XRP. Stay patient, stay critical, and keep your eyes on the plumbing, because that's where the real power always ends up.